I was elbow-deep in hay when I heard her stilettos click across my gravel driveway like nails on a chalkboard. That was my first warning. The second was the unmistakable voice of Elora Addington, head of the Sweet Birch Meadows HOA, and a woman who thought the world owed her a crown and a throne. "Xavier Edmon," she called out, already halfway into my barn like she owned the place. "We need your barn this Saturday. The HOA is hosting a summer gala, and your property is the only one rustic enough to match the theme." I wiped sweat off my brow and leaned against the pitchfork. "You want to use my barn for a party?" "Yes," she said, flashing that tight, insincere grin she reserved for when she was about to trample someone's rights. "We voted on it this morning. Unanimous." "You weren't at the meeting." "That's because I wasn't told there was one." "Well," she sniffed, "you should really check your mailbox more often. Anyway, it's settled." "Settled?" I laughed once, sharp and short. "I never agreed to this." Elora tilted her head like a crow sizing up a shiny object. "You don't need to." Section 18 of the HOA Charter states that any common-use structure within association boundaries can be temporarily requisitioned for approved community events. My barn isn't common use. I built it on my private lot. She gave me a look like I was a toddler who just failed to spell cat. "It's visible from the community trail, which makes it within visual domain. That's Clause 18C. You should really read the fine print." I wanted to throw my boot through the nearest wall. Instead, I pointed toward the wide, open space behind her. "There's a community park literally 2 blocks down." "Yes, but the barn has ambience," she said, drawing the word out like it was made of gold. "Don't worry, we'll tidy up after. Just make sure the animals are out by Friday night." She turned on her heel and marched back to her golf cart, barking into her walkie for the event committee to meet her later and take measurements. No thanks, no request, just a demand wrapped in HOA legalese. I watched her drive off, jaw tight. Then I glanced over at Bruno, my 3,000-pound Scottish Highland bull, who was currently lounging in the back stall like a hairy tank. "Hope you like parties, big guy," I muttered. "Because we're about to throw one hell of a surprise." By the time Friday rolled around, the Sweet Birch Meadows HOA had already begun treating my property like it was the local event center. Folding chairs were stacked just outside the fence line, floral bunting fluttered from posts they'd driven into the ground without so much as a knock on my door, and someone had even wheeled in a sound system that looked borrowed from a wedding venue. I didn't stop them, not once. Let them hang their paper lanterns. Let them set up their little sign in tables and champagne coolers. I had other plans. That morning, I made a quiet call to the county assessor's office. I'd already retrieved a certified copy of my property's original plat map, which clearly distinguished my land boundaries from the common area trails. But I asked for something more specific: documentation showing the barn's construction date, permits, and location coordinates. I had a hunch the HOA had misinterpreted their own charter, or more likely, they were banking on no one reading it closely. While I waited for the files, I rotated Bruno's stall gate open and let him wander the barn freely. He was used to routine, but he knew something was up. His massive frame moved with a slow, deliberate curiosity, snuffling at the corners like he expected me to pull out a treat or a brush. "Not today, buddy," I said, adjusting the latch on the main doors. "Today, you're crowd control." By late afternoon, a line of SUVs and Teslas began to arrive. A couple of folding tables were set up just outside the barn, manned by 2 HOA volunteers in polo shirts and clipboards. I watched from a distance as Elora arrived in a sleeveless silk blouse, wearing a wide-brimmed hat that looked like it belonged at the Kentucky Derby. She strutted across the yard with a glass of something pink in hand, chatting up a real estate agent I recognized from town. I waited until they were all inside. Then I closed the barn doors behind them and threw the bolt across the latches. The shouting started within seconds. First came the confused murmuring, then the shrieking. Then someone must have backed into Bruno because a loud moo rattled the wood planks. "Xavier?" Elora's voice cracked through the walls like a siren. "What is the meaning of this?" I took my time walking up. I made sure to have my phone ready. I tapped the camera and hit record before I even got within earshot. "Everything all right in there?" I called through the door. "There's a beast in here," a man shouted. "This is a health violation. We have a catered buffet." "No one told you to bring food," I replied. "Or trespass." Elora's voice returned, louder, more furious. "Open these doors immediately or I'll have you arrested for unlawful imprisonment." I leaned against the frame, phone still rolling. "Unlawful imprisonment requires that someone be held without legal cause. You're on private property." "I didn't invite you. You entered without permission and refused to leave. That's trespassing. And that barn, not common use. I double-checked the zoning this morning. Want me to send you the coordinates?" "You said nothing when we were setting up," she snapped. I didn't think I needed to stop people from breaking the law. I figured the law would catch up. Behind me, tires crunched along the gravel. I turned and saw Deputy Lorna Wu step out of her cruiser, her hand already resting casually on her belt. "Hey, Xavier," she said. "Got your voicemail." "You were right, the county assessor confirmed that your barn sits fully on your parcel. No HOA easements, no visual domain clause, nothing. Want to walk me through what happened?" I nodded toward the barn. "They broke in, held an unauthorized event, and ignored a direct no from the property owner. They're claiming some clause gives them full control over the building." "Interesting," she said, flipping open her notepad. "Because I also got a copy of their governing documents. Section 18 doesn't say anything about visual domain. That's made up." The bolt creaked as I slid it open. The doors groaned apart, revealing a scene that looked like a Renaissance painting gone wrong. Bruno stood in the center, lazily chewing a mouthful of hay while pastel decorations sagged around him. A folding table had been overturned near the back, and Elora's hat was crushed under one of his hooves. Elora stormed out first, face blotchy and red. "This is outrageous. That animal is a liability. He could have killed someone." Bruno let out a low, unbothered grunt behind her. Deputy Wu kept her voice even. "Ma'am, did you or anyone in your group have written permission to use this property? He didn't say we couldn't. That's not how consent works." As she continued taking statements, I slipped back to the barn and gave Bruno a firm pat on the shoulder. He'd done his job. The fallout came fast. Within 48 hours, I received an apology letter from 2 members of the HOA board who'd apparently been blindsided by Elora's aggressive commandeering of private property. They claimed they'd been told I'd agreed to everything. I didn't bother replying. I sent the emails straight to Deputy Wu, who'd opened a formal investigation into potential HOA fraud and misuse of authority. The county issued a cease and desist order to the HOA, freezing all non-essential operations until a legal audit could be completed. Turns out, Elora had been forging sign-off sheets from residents to push through whatever events she wanted, then burying the paperwork under miscellaneous expenses in the budget. The worst part. She'd been redirecting funds from the HOA reserve account to pay for decorations, catering, and even a private DJ for the barn party. None of it had been approved through legitimate channels. With the audit underway, Deputy Wu and a local prosecutor began building charges for misappropriation of community funds and falsification of legal documents. Elora was removed from her position within a week, though not before she tried to claim the board was persecuting her for visionary leadership. The new interim board, led by a retired school principal named Margaret Hall, reached out to me directly. She asked if I would consider hosting a community town hall to discuss revising the HOA charter with input from actual residents. I agreed on one condition. "We hold it at the park," I said. "Not my barn," she laughed. "I think that's more than fair. Bruno still gets visitors now and then. Parents bring their kids to the fence line to see the famous Sweet Birch bull. And every now and then someone leaves a thank you note tucked under the gate, usually with a little drawing of hooves stomping on a clipboard. He doesn't care much for the attention, but I do. Because sometimes, all it takes is one very large, very patient bull to remind people that no one, no HOA, no entitled neighbor, no clipboard-wielding tyrant gets to trample over what isn't theirs." By the second week after the barn incident, Sweet Birch Meadows felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful, just hushed, like the neighborhood was holding its breath. People walked their dogs a little faster past my property. Some waved without making eye contact. Others slowed down, hesitating near the fence as if expecting something else to happen. Something was happening, just not where they could see it. At the county courthouse, Deputy Wu had passed my documentation to the district attorney's office. Not just the video footage, but the forged signatures, the event flyers listing approved by HOA, and the financial records the interim board had unearthed. That's when things got serious. The DA's office opened a full investigation into Sweet Birch's HOA financial conduct over the past 5 years. Turns out, Elora's barn stunt was just the tip of the glacier. The deeper they dug, the more rot they found: phony contractor invoices, inflated landscaping bills for work never completed, and a supposed community beautification fund that had been used to pay for spa retreats and catered board meetings at a private golf club 2 towns over. I was asked to testify just a preliminary statement, they said, but I arrived with a thick accordion folder and a thumb drive that made the assistant DA raise her eyebrows. "You came prepared," she said. "Elora always liked to leave paper trails," I replied. She just never expected anyone to follow them. Back in Sweet Birch, Margaret Hall had held an emergency town meeting at the park pavilion. I attended quietly, off to the side near the old oak tree, watching as residents slowly realized just how much had been skimmed from their dues. Margaret didn't dramatize it. She laid out the figures, the missing funds, and the names of the contractors who didn't exist. Then she asked a question that had most people shifting in their seats. Did anyone here ever vote on those expenditures? The community upgrades, the party budgets, the maintenance surcharges? No one raised a hand. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Then, a wiry man near the center stood up. I recognized him: Dale, a retired machinist who spent most mornings fiddling with old engines in his garage. "I asked to see the budget breakdown last year," he said. "Twice. Elora told me it was proprietary and that I'd need a lawyer to access it." Margaret simply nodded. "You were lied to." That was the moment the crowd turned. No more murmuring. Just cold, focused silence, like prey realizing it had been stalked for years and was finally ready to fight back. Within 48 hours, a petition to dissolve the current HOA charter had gathered over 200 signatures, more than enough to force a vote. But before that could even happen, the DA's office made its move. Elora Addington was arrested on a Thursday morning, not at her home, but at a luxury shoe boutique 3 towns over, where she was attempting to use the HOA's community debit card to purchase 2 pairs of Italian leather heels. The arrest made local news by noon. The headline practically wrote itself: HOA president caught embezzling in designer pumps paid for by residents. That night, someone printed the article and pinned it to the community bulletin board with a single red thumbtack. By morning, someone else had added a sticky note underneath it that read, "She wanted ambience, she got a booking number." The interim board moved swiftly. A forensic accountant was hired to trace the missing funds. Several HOA board members resigned quietly, citing health reasons or family obligations, but Margaret didn't let them slip away unscathed. She posted public notices summarizing each board member's known decisions and votes, along with the financial records tied to them. And that's when the letters started arriving. At first, it was just a few residents from nearby neighborhoods writing in, asking how Sweet Birch Meadows was cleaning house. Then came the phone calls, and eventually, a request from the Regional Homeowners Alliance asking Margaret to present on community-led reform and fraud prevention. I came home one afternoon to find her leaning against my fence with a man I didn't recognize, broad-shouldered, in his 60s, wearing a navy blue jacket with a gold badge stitched on the front. "Xavier," Margaret said, waving me over. "This is Special Agent Roy Fenwick. He's with the state's Public Integrity Unit." Roy extended a firm hand. "We've had our eye on Sweet Birch's HOA since last fall. You might have just given us the final push. Didn't expect to cause a landslide," I said. "Sometimes a good shove is all it takes," he replied. They explained that Elora's embezzlement wasn't just a local issue. The HOA had received state-level infrastructure grants through a housing renewal program 3 years ago, funds meant for drainage improvements and sidewalk repairs. Not only had that work never been done, but the grant reports had been falsified to show the projects as completed. That pushed the case from county mismanagement to state-level fraud. Roy asked if I'd be willing to provide a more detailed timeline of the barn incident, including the interactions I'd had with board members leading up to it. I agreed, and we scheduled a follow-up at my kitchen table the next day. He showed up with 2 other agents. They brought a scanner, a portable printer, and a metal box full of files. "You've been thorough," one of them said as I handed over my folders. "Years of watching them pull strings without consequences," I said. "You learn to keep receipts." While they worked, I poured coffee and kept the dogs inside. Bruno stood outside the barn, watching them with the same calm, disinterested gaze he applied to everything. Roy noticed him and nodded. "That the bull that started all this. 3,000 pounds of community service," I said. The investigation eventually expanded beyond Sweet Birch. Several other HOAs in neighboring towns were found to have overlapping vendors, identical invoice templates, and similar patterns of financial rounding errors. The scheme had been bigger than anyone imagined, a network of board presidents and treasurers funneling money through dummy companies and shell accounts. Elora's trial was scheduled for the fall. She faced charges including wire fraud, falsifying public records, and misappropriation of government funds. When her lawyer tried to paint the barn incident as an overreaction by a disgruntled resident, the DA's office rolled out the security footage. The jury didn't flinch. Back in Sweet Birch, things had changed. The HOA charter was rewritten entirely. Membership was made voluntary, financial records were posted monthly on a public website, and all board meetings were now recorded and archived for transparency. Dale, the retired machinist, was elected treasurer. Margaret remained chair. I declined when they asked me to join, saying I preferred to keep my hands in the dirt, not on a gavel, but I did agree to one thing. Each year, on the anniversary of the barn incident, Sweet Birch Meadows now hosts a community potluck. Not in the barn, never again, but in the park, with picnic blankets and folding chairs, and a big hand-painted sign that reads, "Respect the fence." Bruno gets a corner all to himself, roped off with hay bales and a bucket of apples. The kids love him, the adults. Well, they understand him now. Not just as a bull, but as a symbol. Because in a neighborhood where power once belonged to clipboards and closed doors, it took one stubborn man, one very large animal, and a whole lot of documentation to remind everyone that ownership doesn't mean control, and that real community doesn't come from rules enforced with fear, but from people standing up when it matters most. I didn't expect to see Elora again. After the trial, after the headlines and the mugshot that got printed in glossy color on the front page of the local paper, I figured she'd vanish into obscurity or a minimum security facility. But one gray morning in early October, I opened my mailbox and found a sealed envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter on fine, stationery, heavy, linen textured, the kind you'd expect from a wedding invitation, not someone facing felony charges. The letter was brief. Apologetic in tone, but not in substance. She never used the word sorry. Instead, she called the events of the past year regrettable misunderstandings and expressed her hope for eventual reconciliation within the community. She also mentioned that constructive leadership often faces unjust scrutiny. I read it twice, then tossed it into the fireplace without replying. Whatever image she was trying to salvage didn't matter anymore. The neighborhood had moved on without her, and the systems she once controlled were now operated transparently, with checks and balances that actually meant something. Still, her letter lingered in the back of my mind, not because I feared her return, but because it reminded me of something I hadn't yet dealt with. The real estate developer. His name was Lester Vance. Quiet, well-dressed, and always in the background, Lester had attended nearly every HOA function Elora hosted over the past 2 years. I used to see him standing near the refreshment tables, sipping flavored water and talking into a Bluetooth earpiece. No one ever asked why he was there. Most folks assumed he was just someone's cousin or a vendor. Turns out, he was part of a larger scheme. While the DA's office had focused on financial fraud and misuse of grant money, a separate investigation had been quietly brewing in the county planning department. It was triggered by a zoning request that proposed reclassifying a portion of Sweet Birch Meadows greenbelt into mixed commercial use. The request was filed 6 months before Elora's arrest. It was signed not by her, but by Lester, using a company called Oakridge Holdings LLC. What caught the attention of planning officials wasn't the request itself, but the attached documents specifically, letters of approval from the HOA board that were dated weeks before the board had actually voted on anything. Some of the signatures were copied from older meeting minutes, down to the pixel. When the new board got wind of it, they passed everything to the state attorney general's office. Within days, a fraud investigation was opened. I didn't hear about it until Margaret knocked on my door with a stack of papers in one hand and a box of manila folders in the other. Lester's plan wasn't just about property reclassification, she said, setting the box on my coffee table. He was trying to acquire the land behind your barn quietly. The trail system, the adjacent slope, even the retention pond, all under the guise of community revitalization. I flipped open one of the folders and saw a map my property highlighted in blue, the surrounding lots marked in orange. A dotted line cut straight through my pasture and terminated at the corner of the barn. They wanted to build a private access road through here, I muttered. Margaret nodded. It would have connected to the main road and given them an entry point for a multi-unit development. Apartments, retail space, maybe even a gas station. They called it Birchwood Village. I looked up. They were going to bulldoze the greenbelt. Not just bulldoze it, she replied. They were going to do it without informing a single homeowner. The whole thing hinged on HOA control. That's why Elora needed the board stacked with her people. That's why she tried to reframe your barn as a community asset. Once they claimed it was within their domain, the rest of the land would follow. It all clicked. The gala, the decorations, the fabricated clause about visual domain. That was never about ambience. It was about precedent. If she could get the community to accept that the HOA had rights over private structures, it would legitimize the rezoning application. They were laying the groundwork for a private land grab, I said. And using residents' dues to do it, Margaret added. The AG's office didn't wait long. Armed with forged documents, falsified meeting records, and testimony from multiple displaced board members who'd agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity, they issued a warrant for Lester Vance. He was arrested at a golf course in South Carolina where he'd been meeting with investors for another project. His laptop was seized on the spot. Investigators found spreadsheets detailing projected profits from the development, over $20 million in net gain, assuming community resistance is neutralized by Q3. When federal agents reviewed his emails, they found communication with other HOA leaders in neighboring counties. The pattern repeated: manipulation of board elections, fraudulent use of community funds, and targeted rezoning applications filed under shell companies. Sweet Birch had been his pilot project. A test run. The fallout was massive. The state legislature introduced new legislation requiring independent audits for HOAs receiving government grants. HOA board members would now be considered fiduciaries under state law, making them legally accountable for financial mismanagement. Margaret testified before the legislative committee, detailing how a small group of determined residents had uncovered one of the most coordinated HOA frauds in state history. She didn't mention me by name, but she did refer to a certain livestock-loving neighbor who'd set the first domino tumbling. That night, I got a call from Deputy Wu. Her voice sounded lighter, relieved. "It's over," she said. Vance pleaded guilty to wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud the government, and attempted land theft. He's looking at 15 years. What about Elora? She's been transferred to a federal facility. Her plea deal depends on full cooperation names, dates, documentation. If she holds anything back, the deal's off. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. The knot in my chest, the one I'd carried since the barn incident, finally started to loosen. Winter came early that year. Snow dusted the rooftops by late November, and the trail behind my property stayed quiet. No more golf carts, no more event committees, just the occasional jogger bundled up against the wind, waving politely as they passed. One morning, I found a small package on my porch. No label, no note. Inside was a hand-carved wooden plaque about the size of a license plate. It had been lacquered and sanded smooth, with 2 words carved deep into the grain: property respected. I mounted it over the barn doors. Bruno, unchanged and unbothered, still roamed the pasture like a monarch surveying his kingdom. He'd taken to resting near the fence line again, watching the trail but never reacting to it. Maybe he sensed what had changed, or maybe he just enjoyed the quiet. Margaret stopped by now and then, usually with a folder or a question about bylaws. But mostly, people left me be. They'd learned something important, not just about the dangers of unchecked power, but about what happens when ordinary folks push back. Sweet Birch wasn't perfect, but it was honest now. And that was something I could live with. As for the barn, it never hosted another party, but if you ask the neighbors, they'll tell you that was the night the HOA finally learned what private property truly meant. And no one, not a clipboard, not a clause, not even a crook in designer heels, was going to forget it again.